Hello friends, my name is Cindy and I am one of the children's librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And today we're going to be reading Racial Justice in America, What is the Black Lives Matter Movement by Hedrick Nichols with Kalisa Wing. And this is what it looks like. Chapter 1, an intro to Black Lives Matter. Almost everyone is treated unfairly at some time in their life. People can be treated poorly because they belong to a certain cultural group or because of what they stand for. They can be discriminated against because of mental or physical disabilities. People can be treated unfairly because they are too rich or too poor, too tall or too short, too loud or too quiet, too religious or not religious enough. But unfairness and anti-Black racism are different. America's legal and educational systems make it harder for people in the Black community to get a good education, be successful, and build wealth. When these systems put one cultural group at a disadvantage, it's called systemic racism. Black people are also subject to racial profiling. In 2012, Trayvon Martin was killed by a neighborhood watch volunteer. The Black teenager was unarmed and looked suspicious. The shooter was charged with murder but not found guilty. This made people angry and sad. Alicia Garcia, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi called for justice for Trayvon using the hashtag Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter BLM movement was born the next year. And here is a protest. It says protesters rally toward the Sanford Police Department in support of Trayvon Martin. In 2014, another unarmed teenager, Michael Brown, was murdered by police in Ferguson, Missouri. Again, BLM responded, launching the organization into the mainstream as a movement. Since then, those advocating for justice in the deaths of other Black people have used the hashtag Black Lives Matter. The words Black Lives Matter are another way of saying, hey, the lives of Black people are important too. BLM supports communities in their fight against anti-Black racism. It also supports efforts by other marginalized groups, women's rights, LGBTQ, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer rights, and immigrants' legal and human rights. Understanding the Black Lives Matter movement can help you support people who experience racism and the loss of human rights. And then there are a couple of pictures. It says signs in front of the White House show support for the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. The sign says, when I show it to you, this was not a wake-up call. This was the last straw. And then the other picture, it says Bill de Blasio, Al Sharpton, and volunteers paint a Black Lives Matter mural on 5th Avenue in New York City in 2020. Chapter 2, Backstory. Slavery in America started before the framing of the country's legal system. George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and others had enslaved people working in their homes, cooking and cleaning. The enslaved Africans and their descendants worked the land of their enslavers to plant and harvest. People rich enough to own people as slaves usually got richer because they kept the money they would have had to pay regular workers. The enslavers also had more rights and more privileges. People in slavery got nothing. They could not earn money. They could not inherit money from their fathers or pass money on to their children, which is how white families have been able to gain wealth across generations. For most of the Black people in America, especially in the South, enslavement continued for almost 250 years, from 1619 to 1865. Once slaves were free, they lived in poverty, and many died. If they survived, another 100 years of Jim Crow laws and segregation made America a difficult place for most former slaves and their descendants. These laws made it legal in many instances to prevent Black people from owning land or businesses. And the picture I'm about to show you says, segregation was everywhere in America until the late 1900s. Its effects are still felt today. So they had, in this picture, they had fountains, drinking fountains for people who were Black and people who were white. There were exceptions like Harlem, New York, and Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. These black communities flourished with their own stores, banks, restaurants, luxury hotels, and fine homes. Black achievements drew many to these growing communities, but it also produced resentment in surrounding white communities. Black residents often faced violence and terrorism by white people who beat and killed them and burned their homes and businesses to the ground. Now, this is a little sidebar about Black Wall Street. It says Black Wall Street was a wealthy black community that flourished in the early 1900s. O.W. Gurley was a teacher, politician, and landowner. He mapped out a community he called Greenwood. Black people seeking opportunity came to Greenwood and built successful businesses. Greenwood became one of the most prominent and wealthy post-emancipation communities in the country. In 1921, a black man of Greenwood was accused of a crime against a white woman. A white mob demanded the man be handed over to them. Fearing a lynching, a large group of armed black men arrived to protect him. White citizens responded by burning Greenwood down using torches and kerosene bombs dropped from airplanes. The angry mob completely destroyed the 35-square-block community, killing hundreds of people. No one was ever prosecuted for the destruction of Black Wall Street. And this is a picture of it after it was destroyed, part of it. Lynching is a word that describes illegal mob killings of black people. White people would forcibly take black people and hang them from trees, burn them alive, or beat them until death or near death. Lynching was used to control and terrorize the black community, and often it happened in front of an audience. Learn more about the history of lynching from the Smithsonian film, An Outrage. Although slavery had ended, equal rights were not given to black citizens. Especially in the South, segregation, violence, and lynching were used to maintain the pre-Civil War social order in which white people maintained power over black people. To combat violence and discrimination, organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which the acronym is NAACP, were formed. Founded in 1909, the NAACP is the oldest, perhaps most well-known organization fighting for civil rights. Much like today's BLM movement, it began in response to riots in which black people were targeted and killed. Most of the NAACP's early leadership was white and included women suffragists like Mary White Ovington and Inez Milholland. Later in the 1900s came the Congress of Racial Equality. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, led by Dr. Martin Luther King, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Community, founded by Inez Baker. These activist groups became the driving forces behind the great civil rights movements of the 1960s. Protests highlighted the systemic injustices still endured by black people 100 years after the end of slavery. Activists led the black community in advocating for human rights and for legal help and protections that had been historically denied them. Because of the civil rights movement, schools and businesses began to be integrated. Additionally, laws were made to protect black people from vigilante and police violence. And there's a picture, a very long picture I'm going to show you of an NAACP meeting in Atlanta, Georgia in June 1, 1920. Chapter 3, BLM Today. After the protests of the 1960s, it seemed that there was real change in issues surrounding race in America, but data collected in the decades that followed showed racial progress in education and jobs had stalled or stopped. Although the NAACP, the SCLC, and other groups never stopped advocating for change, the number of large demonstrations and marches decreased until the 2000s. A number of high-profile killings of black citizens in police custody and by white vigilantes showed that there was a renewed need for organized protests and anti-racist activism. Policing policies. The majority of police officers today take the job to serve and protect, but cell phone cameras have shined a light on officers who abuse their power. After repeated viral video footage of police violence against Black people, lawmakers have begun to examine policies. The hashtag Black Lives Matter is used to call attention to such inequities and advocate for more in-depth investigation and legal reform. And the picture I'm going to show you says, police and activists collide in downtown Houston, Texas during protests of the beating and killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis by Minneapolis police in May of 2020. Patrice Cullors grew up understanding the importance of powerful organizations like the NAACP and the National Action Network, but she didn't feel they were speaking to her generation. With well-known female and LGBTQ leaders, Black Lives Matter speaks to younger citizens. The movement is guided by an alliance of 16 local chapters that have the freedom to act in their communities. BLM's focus is on community action and social justice in the form of the following: directing funding formerly dedicated to policing into educational and community programming, expanding investment in Black businesses, healthcare, education, and community ventures to make up for the years Black citizens were kept from accessing and building wealth, ending unfair practices like gerrymandering and voter suppression. And the picture I'm going to show you says, massive crowds on Sunset Boulevard in California during Black Lives Matter protests. This is in Los Angeles, June 14th, 2020. Look at all those people. Deep dive into fake news. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to free speech, but how can you tell if what you hear or read is speaking the truth? If you're unsure, go to factcheck.org, politifact.org, or snopes.com. These sites can help you decide if something is true or false, or print out this worksheet, How to Identify Fake News in 10 Steps, at http library.pfeffer. Well, I'll show you this, and you can actually pause it and write it down if you'd like. And see if you can figure it out yourself. The hashtag #SayTheirNames has also been used to call attention to racial injustice that often surrounds the violent deaths of Black people. The website Say Every Name examines the circumstances surrounding the deaths and the outcomes of the legal cases, and mostly it pays respects to lives ended too soon. What happens when protests end? Do research online to find out how BLM is making an impact in the fight against racism and discrimination. The Black Lives Matter movement gained international support when George Floyd was killed by a police officer in 2020. BLM protests began in Minneapolis, where Floyd was murdered, and quickly spread throughout the country. Most major U.S. cities held rallies and marches, and the picture I'm going to show you says Black Lives Matter protest in Breda, the Netherlands, in 2020. The horrific images of Floyd's murder went viral, and the movement became one of the largest in history. People around the world began to advocate for anti-racist policing and human rights for Black American citizens. They examined racism in their own countries. BLM marches, rallies, and vigils were held in over 60 countries and on every continent except Antarctica. Protests were held in streets, town squares, and in front of U.S. embassies. Some governments, like those in Fort Worth, Texas, and Washington, D.C., allowed citizens to paint Black Lives Matter on certain streets. The murals in bold, yellow, and black letters cover several city blocks. The mural in Washington, D.C. is near the White House and is large enough to be seen from space. And here's a picture of it. In the spring, summer, and fall of 2020, an estimated 20 million people protested in support of Black Lives Matter. In keeping with the movement's values, almost all of the protests worldwide were peaceful. However, some of the protesters were not members of the movement and did not have the same values. Fringe groups looted and vandalized property. Some media outlets began to focus on violent clashes between citizens and police. Propaganda on social media blamed Black Lives Matter for the violence. Some people wrongly believed that BLM thought only Black Lives mattered. They condemned BLM as violent and anti-white. These groups, some with ties to white supremacist groups, started using hashtags like All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter. Tweets by U.S. President Donald Trump also spread anti-BLM sentiment, calling the movement a symbol of hate. Social media posts and misinformation further inflamed tensions. Federal troops were sent into some cities to crack down on local protesters. Violent clashes worsened. And the picture I'm going to show you says, when using social media and reading online news, be sure you know the information is from a credible source before believing or sharing it. Anti-racist groups like Wall of Moms and Wall of Vets came out in support of BLM. These largely white groups protested the presence of federal troops and police violence. Local governments filed lawsuits against the U.S. government for violating First Amendment rights. The United Nations and Amnesty International, two government watchdogs, issued human rights violation warnings to the U.S. government because citizens and journalists were being harmed and jailed. Women dressed, this picture says, women dressed in yellow form a wall of moms during a march against the death of Elijah McClain and racial injustice in Aurora, Colorado. Federal troops were withdrawn, but negative media coverage hurt the Black Lives Matter image. Leaders of the movement condemned violence, breaking with groups that weren't focused solely on the issues. Calls for peace and focus on the movement's message have followed. And the next picture I'm going to show you says, military veterans holding a sign and American flag in support of Black Lives Matter and First Amendment rights. Do the work. Essential question. How can we be anti-racist? Becoming anti-racist requires actively working against racism using words and actions. This project-based learning assignment will allow you to practice these skills. Read all the books in the Racial Justice in America series. Through each Do the Work activity, you will research and put together parts of a larger project that will allow you to grow and help others to grow as well. How does civil disobedience play a role in the movement? The Black Lives Matter movement is similar to other movements in the 1960s with its commitment to nonviolence. For this portion of the assignment, research two other movements that utilized civil disobedience and other forms of nonviolent protests. What does the term civil disobedience mean? Why is it effective? What do the movements you researched have in common with BLM? How are they different? For the presentation of your final work, you can create a collage, a magazine, a podcast, jigsaw puzzle, a poem, a video, or social media campaign, anything to demonstrate your learning. No matter what you do, just be creative, learn something new, and publicize your work. Chapter 4, Supporting BLM. There are many ways to support the Black Lives Matter movement. Some people march. Some promote content highlighting the ongoing need for social change on social media. Others help paint murals like the ones pictured in this book. Some people donate to the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation to help fund advocacy groups. Still others support the movement's core values by standing up for Black people or anyone being treated unfairly because of how they look or identify. Supporting and valuing the lives of Black citizens is supporting and valuing human life. Valuing human life is what Black Lives Matter is all about. And this picture says, marching is just one way to show support of the Black Lives Matter movement. What can you do to create a safe space to talk about race? Project Engage. Does your school have a safe space to work through issues of race, identity, and acceptance? How can you apply the core principles of the Black Lives Matter movement to create a more inclusive school community, even if no Black people attend your school? Start a club to talk about racism and anti-racism. Practice civil disagreement, uncomfortable conversation, and agreeing to disagree. On the next page is a structure you can use to get started, or you can create your own. The important thing is that you find a way to create a more equitable, inclusive world. So there's an acronym that says ENGAGE, and these are what they stand for. E, educate yourself by reading fiction and nonfiction books or articles from diverse authors. N, name your feelings about people who are different from you. Do you have biases against certain groups? How did they develop? G, get rid of biases by working through your feelings. Read about how others have overcome their biases, or talk to a friend who can help you grow. A, actively read and research to learn the stories of people who are different from you. G, get to know people as individuals. Refuse to generalize. E, establish regular meetups to talk about and work through issues of race and social justice in your community. And here's a picture of that. If you want to pause, you could write them down. But you can also check this book out of the library if you're interested in reading it and doing some of these things for yourself. So that was Racial Justice in America, What is the Black Lives Matter Movement by Hedrick Nichols with Kalisa Wing. And I hope that you enjoyed reading this with me. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that you'll come back soon to visit us. My name is Cindy. I'm one of the children's librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And I will see you soon, friends. Bye-bye.